Good evening, everyone. My name is Philip Yan. I'm co-president and co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs, and I would like to welcome you to our building this evening. Um, I'm delighted to moderate our conversation with Emily Feng, we value your thoughtful dialogue of programs like tonight. So we encourage you to explore Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership. Members enjoy exclusive benefits, but more importantly, their support keeps these conversations accessible, independent, and open to all. And these days, that's incredibly important. So let's go on to our program. Emily is an award-winning international correspondent for National Public Radio, NPR, and the author of the new book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, which I have here. With more than a decade of reporting experience across the Asia Pacific, including years based in Beijing, Emily has documented how ordinary people in China are navigating, and in some cases, quietly resisting the increasing demands of a powerful and technologically sophisticated and authoritarian central government. We have China that is closing in on it itself from outsiders and yet asserting itself internationally in a very, very muscular and sometimes provocative way. Emily's book asks a deceptively simple question. Who gets to be considered Chinese under Xi Jinping's vision of the nation, and what happens to those who don't fit in? And so with that sort of chapeau, let's everyone welcome Emily. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Philip.
So what I'm going to be doing is the way I do this generally is just to ask a lot of questions, and I kind of jump all over the place because I want all of you to get a flavor of this book, which is really a lot of fun to read. It's very accessible, and then hopefully provoke questions from you. You have your notes, pens, and piece of paper to ask questions so we can go for there. So let's start, okay? How are you today, by the way?
I'm great.
Okay,
Thanks
good.
for asking.
Yeah,
Today the weather was amazing.
Yeah. So I want to set the frame for us. Your book titled Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, which is here again, comes from the phrase tied to ideological conformity. And before we dive into the individual case stories where you talk about 12 individuals, and I think it's a really interesting way you tell the story about China and your experiences there, but through these individual stories about individuals, why don't you explain what the phrase means in today's China and why it felt like the right lens for you to, tell these stories?
Sure. So the phrase comes from, I think I talked to Bob here at Studied Chinese History, so I'm sure you know exactly where the phrase comes from, but it comes from one of the mass political campaigns in the 1950s, early on in Chinese history, in the PRC and the People's Republic of China, and it's part of the Hundred Flowers movement. So this idea that Chairman Mao says, okay, I know basically that we've been politically very repressive, but I actually do really want to hear your ideas. So express yourself freely. I want to see 100 flowers bloom. And people take that as encouragement to go out and write big character posters and write editorials and essays. And unfortunately, a lot of them get arrested soon afterwards. So 100 flowers bloom, but they're cut down very, very quickly. And the title, That Only Red Flowers Bloom, was actually a direct quote from one of the main characters, or one of the peripheral characters in this book. And I remember I was doing this interview with him years and years ago, and it ended up being part of a news story for NPR. And he wasn't the main character, he wasn't the story itself, but he said something to me about now only the Communist Party wants red flowers to bloom. Orange flowers, purple flowers, pink flowers, none of those are red, and all of those need to be culled. And I heard that phrase, and it lodged in my brain, and when I was writing this book and I was coming up with the title, that phrase kept coming up. And so that ended up being the title of the book. And I chose it because I thought it summarized so well the homogenization of the China that I spent almost 10 years reporting on and from, and to its own detriment. But its diversity was one of the reasons why I loved reporting from the country to begin with, and why I still find it so fascinating to this day.
So let's talk really quickly. I mean, one of the things that I think maybe people who don't know China are surprised to hear how diverse it actually is. And can you talk about that was something that surprised you when you went to China for the first time, right?
Right. So I am Chinese American. My sister is actually here in the audience, so she knows our family history. But both of our parents were born and raised in China, and they had us here in the US, and we were raised here. But I was always so curious about this China. But the China in my mind was, of course, a very two-dimensional version of China from the 80s, which is when my parents had left the country. We would go maybe every 5 or 6 years to visit family. Our family lives in the south of China near Shanghai. And so when I actually went to China as an adult for the first time and was traveling beyond the Shanghai region, and I was going to the northwest or to the west or even farther south into China and encountering not just cuisines and landscapes that were different from what I've been used to, but wholesale languages, different languages of the various groups of Chinese languages that exist in the country. And different histories, different ethnicities, religions. I was blown away. And that really fed my motivation to see as much of the country as possible and to understand how all of those came together and interacted with one another in one country. But very, very soon into my time in China, uh, Xi Jinping had just come to power, actually. It was his second year as chairman of the party when I moved to China, and you could already sense some of the political tightening in the country in the early years that I moved there. One of the big stories, actually, now that I think about it, the month that I moved to China in July 2015 was the month that authorities rounded up about 300 human rights lawyers. There had been a really robust constitutional law movement to take what was written in China's own constitution and enforce civil liberties and human rights. And they won some important legal victories, particularly in the like feminist rights and environmental rights space. And the week that I moved to China, they'd arrested about 300 of these lawyers, and many of them ultimately were disbarred, so they could no longer practice law. And that was a pretty clear sign, an omen, if you will, I think, of the rest of my time in China.
Yeah, so I remember going to China several times right before he came to power, and before he was formally elected. And I remember the train stations were shut down and only certain people could go. It was a very interesting time, and it just probably felt a little bit different. Everyone was on edge, and I think at that point there was this time where people thought this whole anti-corruption sort of movement that he really pushed for once into power was about to start. I think people were feeling a little worried about that. Um, so for the book, it was really interesting. You talk, as I said, there are about 12 different kinds of people that you talk about. You talk about a lawyer that you met, businessmen, the scooter thief. We can talk about him, the chained woman, as a way to tell the story about China. And one of the things that you mentioned that I found really interesting is succinctly what you said. The theme that ties everything together, and this is what we were talking about, is really what you said about who gets to be Chinese and why that's important. Okay, I thought that was a really interesting framing for you, and and you not only talk about China state's intense preoccupation with identity, like ethnic, linguist, cultural, political, but you talk about how you know um, you you talk about how that affects everything that they do. So can you explain that a little bit? And um, I had not heard of, so thank you, about Document 9, right? Which I thought was really interesting since you talked about that. So maybe talk about Document 9 really quickly, and then talk about the whole Chinese identity thing as you framed it for the book.
Sure. When I thought about identity, I took a really broad approach. So I was thinking not just about ethnic and religious and cultural identity, but also political identities. There are so many different, obviously, opinions and visions for what China should be and what it should stand for and how it should develop in China. And there was a very robust conversation about that in the civil liberties and in the civil society space, even when I moved to China in 2015. So I wanted to get at that. And many of the characters I chose were not dissidents. These were people who considered themselves Chinese patriots, oftentimes worked within the system. So they were public servants or worked, in the case of the lawyer that you mentioned, in the state prosecutor's office in the province where she's from. But then simply by living the life that they want and pursuing the dreams that they have for the China that they envision for themselves, they come into conflict with the state in some way. So that's what I meant by identity. And in terms of Document 9, that was kind of a foundational news story for me. I don't know if Steve was a colleague of mine, a friend of mine in Beijing who works for the New York Times. Were you already there in China when Document 9 came out? I think it was early 2009 or something. Anyways, it was a leaked Communist Party internal document that came out very, very early in Xi Jinping's days as chairman of the party that laid out these concepts that were dangerous to the party. So things like um, freedom of expression, the pollution of foreign ideas in the internal kind of cultural sphere of China. And it was very, very sweeping. And I remember reading that at the time. I think I was still in high school, actually. But I remember reading that and going, I know nothing about this country that they call China that my parents came from. This sounds really, really scary, but it sounds really, really interesting. And it was a huge privilege to then get to report on the after effects of this document, which I think looking back was really, if we had to point to a watershed moment, that might have been it in the party's direction towards one that was more about retrenchment and security, and one that was really, really anxious about accidentally replicating the fate of the Soviet Union, which it turns out Xi Jinping was a close student of and was thinking about when before he became chairman of the party and he was president of the top party cadre training school in Beijing.
So you think that's the basis for the homogenization that you're talking about?
It certainly is part of it. He has these internal speeches that were also leaked and reported on in Chinese media and then foreign language media about why did the Soviet Union collapse? And his theory was that it had splintered, it had internal fractions, and that those different factions had caused the disintegration, and no one, quote, was man enough to stand up against that. And so he's thinking a lot about what internal divisions are there in Chinese society that he needs to address to make sure that Chinese society, under the leadership of the Communist Party, also doesn't disintegrate. And I think with people behind him, like Wang Huning, who is now in the Standing Politburo, who are also thinking about these really big conceptual ideas, not just granular economic and security policy, they're starting to think about what is the core of Chinese identity. For so long, it was about endless revolution. But it's hard to argue, and it's hard to feel as an average Chinese citizen today that revolution, socialist revolution, is really that relevant to your life. Um, so if it's not about revolution and it's not about anti-imperialism, then and it's less and less about economic development as well, then what is it that the party stands for and how do they represent China? And so you see a discussion about, well, core socialist values, like those posters about core socialist values were posted everywhere by 2016. And I think you then see a greater preoccupation of like culturally, what does being Chinese mean? And that's when minority groups like the Uyghurs or the Mongolians or the Hui Muslims start to come under much greater scrutiny, as they had before, but I think to a much greater degree this time around.
So yeah, I mean, you do talk about those different groups of people, and so how how has that affected them? I mean, what are what are the policies that are coming in that are affecting them in a way that you've reported on that struck you as surprising, sad? What uh, um, you talk about meeting people. How have they helped you understand fear, courage, and resistance in China? Tell me a little bit more about that.
There's been, round after round of security crackdowns and uh, outright political re-education and labor camps and things like that in PRC history. But I think what was new and what I was reporting about was just the scale. And I think one of the biggest stories of the years that I was in China was what happened in the Xinjiang region,
Right.
which was an estimated 1 to 3 million Uyghur adults were detained. Some of them were imprisoned for long periods of time afterwards. And there had been, honestly, every decade or two, what they call strike hard campaigns in Xinjiang. But the number, the way that this penetrated Xinjiang society was, I think, to a scale that hadn't been seen before. And it, there had been gulags and there had been re-education camps, but it was the extent to which the region was securitized and how it was explicitly aimed at Uyghur identity.
So you,
That made me very interested, and then going back to this topic in this book and looking at it through the lens of 3 or 4 individuals
right.
whose lives really were upended by
So
this.
why don't we talk about them? I mean, the people that came to mind were who you, if I recall, was the believer and the model minority, right? Talk about each one of, and maybe talk a little bit about each of those and what affected you or what you found compelling about their particular stories.
Sure. So, The Believer is the story of this Hui Muslim man who grows up largely secular, but he comes of age during opening and reform in the 1980s in China. And so finally, he has the ability to go to the mosque again, which is just reopened. He ends up studying at one of the Islamic institutes run by the state in Beijing. And then he's able to study in Pakistan. He's able to make the Hajj to Mecca. And he becomes convinced that Islam, first of all, he becomes much more religious than he was before, but he also becomes convinced that Islam is a uniquely Chinese religion. And he starts writing a lot about how Chinese philosophies and Confucianism and Taoism actually suffuse the ideas of Islam. And most controversially, he believes that Confucius was one of the Muslim prophets. And so he's actually not very well liked among some Muslim communities in China. But he has this idea that you can be both Chinese and Muslim. And uh, he's Hui Muslim. You know, this is like an ethnic categorization on his ID card in China, but he believes that one is not born Muslim, that you can become Muslim, and so he starts to proselytize, which is quite dangerous. And in this effort to thread the needle between being both Chinese and Muslim, he obviously gets into trouble, and then the crackdown in neighboring Xinjiang starts. So he's living in between Henan and Shanxi province at the time, but the crackdown in Xinjiang ends up ensnaring some of his relatives that live there, and a lot of people who are buying his books and in correspondence with him also get detained, and so he eventually has to leave the country. He was interesting to me because he was thinking so explicitly about identity and about whether identities can coexist and how they overlap. And also, a very, very nerdy side, I think, gets into the history of Islam in China, which is it's developed into a kind of its own thing because of its combination with local beliefs and practices. And I've always loved reporting from historically Muslim areas in China, whether it's Gansu and Ningxia or even Qinghai, Xinjiang. Um, the model minority is a chapter. It was actually one of the last chapters that I reported. I wasn't sure if I was going to write about it or not, but after some thought, I decided to include it. And it tells the story of a Mongolian man, a software engineer, who um, becomes an IT engineer, works in Beijing, eventually returns home. And throughout his childhood, he's noticing the changes that are happening in Inner Mongolia. More and more Han Chinese people are moving in, more state owned companies that are doing extractive resource industries like mining in particular are moving in. And by the time he gets to middle school, his public school education goes from half Mongolian language and Mandarin language education to purely Mandarin language education. And he doesn't really have any strong opinions about this. And in fact, this is true of most Mongolians I found in China. And it's why they're considered a model minority. They have, on average, very, very high educational and professional attainment in China, higher, in fact, on average than Han Chinese people. And they have economically benefited from these companies coming into Inner Mongolia. The environment hasn't benefited, but it's certainly raised the standard of living in these places. And unlike other ethnic minority groups, and particularly the Uyghurs, there has never really been any kind of mass resistance, much less armed resistance against Communist Party rule. But Adia, that's his name, gets enamored with the 2019 Hong Kong protests against an anti-extradition bill that Beijing and Hong Kong have proposed for Hong Kong. And he starts downloading all these videos, and that process radicalizes him. He starts thinking about his own identity. He ends up taking an after-school program for Mongolian children and making it more of a Mongolian language class. And eventually the school is closed down. And so through his eyes and through his story, I wanted to get at how people come to understand their own identities, and in particular, language policy. You know, language is such a fraught subject in China, whether it's the fact that most everyone now speaks Mandarin, this medley of different dialects and accents that was kind of man made and is now taught as the standard Chinese in school. Um, the loss of local dialects, and also the loss of the many, many languages that were taught in different regions in China. But what was surprising to me was when finally the Ministry of Education in China decided to reduce the amount of Mongolian language education in the region, a lot of parents and people like Adia came out and they protested. And this was a big surprise. I mean, not just for foreign correspondents, we all went there to report on the story, but I think it was a big surprise for local authorities as well, because they didn't think that these people who had been model minorities and supported many of the party's policies before would really care about textbook policy, something as dry as textbook policy.
So, you know, we have the ethnic minorities, the Uyghurs. I mean, it was very interesting. You talked about technology and surveillance, and I think the story of the Uyghurs is one that you used as, a way to convey what's going on. And y- can you just sort of describe for you the first time you went there, you saw what people saw what was going on and how they were enforcing, I guess, you know, uh, you know, the the party line of what it means to be Chinese and wanting everyone to become Chinese in among the Uyghur minorities, the surveillance that's going on there.
The surveillance really became much more obvious during COVID.
Right.
And it was because public health did require you to understand where people were moving, but it also meant that it was much easier to track people by phone. I I think back to surveillance and how I encountered it in China now, and it seems almost antiquated. Like it seems almost this is what the status
Right.
quo is now, and it's so mainstream. But for example, the first couple of times I went to the Xinjiang region to do reporting, this would have been um, early 2017. You I think also because I wasn't really well known to authorities either, you could go to the region and you could talk to people, and I wouldn't record them and I wouldn't take their names, but you could do a lot of street level interviews. And by the third time I went there to report, and by then the detention campaign was well underway in the region, somehow they would know immediately as soon as I got off the plane which hotel I was going to stay at, which I hadn't even booked yet. And so they would have people from the propaganda minister already waiting to receive me. And even if I took like a random taxi out to a relatively rural area in Xinjiang, within about 45 minutes, they would know where the taxi was. And they would also send someone from the propaganda ministry and they're always very nice actually, to ask if I needed help, uh, which inevitably scared everyone away. And, this just got the time in between going someplace and then having contact with, officials just got shorter and shorter.
Mhm.
And there was at least one instance in which I did an anonymous phone interview with someone, and the 2 days later, they got a call from their professor saying that, "We understand that you've done an interview with so and so, and we would like
Hmm.
you to retract it." And this was an anonymous interview. I published something in text only without their name.
Right, right.
So, I don't know if they were listening to their phones or how they triangulated that. There were times I got to the point where to to book reporting trips, I wouldn't book anything until I was in the taxi on the way to the airport. And I wouldn't book any hotels either. Sometimes I would even do things where I would fly someplace, do as much reporting as possible, and fly back the same day because the hotels were away. You have to register at hotels. It was a very, very easy way for the police to know that you were there. And even doing that, not booking your tickets ahead of time. In Mongolia, I did that, and I Inner Mongolia, and I was met right outside the airport by traffic police
Right.
who knew that I was coming, stopped the car, and took all of our documents. So I'm
Y-
sure there's a low tech way to just to understand how they did all of this, but it really made it compressed the amount of reporting you could do because you felt you were on a race against time. The stopwatch would immediately start as soon as you hit the ground to talk to people on certain stories.
So this strikes me about journalism under pressure, journalism in a society that suppresses information, right? That's politically, that they regard as politically dangerous. Um, you reported much of your material at a time when foreign journalists were, increasingly getting more restrictions, right? And did you feel at any point in danger? Did you feel, and what circumstance was that? Were you worried about what was going to happen to you? And what was it like for your colleagues reporting in China during that time? COVID was where a lot of information was being suppressed in certain ways. People were trying to find out more and more. Tell us about that.
I like the challenge, so I mean, I still kind of enjoyed it, but yeah, I often was very stressed, and I was during COVID, I was really worried about being quarantined, and, uh, on one reporting trip, I mean, we had all of the tests and the right paperwork and everything, but in order to it was a random story about property demolitions, and I think they were very nervous about the story, and so they ended up trying to, quarantine us for 2 weeks in this random place in the middle of China. Like, they sent police officers, and they clearly had put on white medical jackets halfway through. Um, I think the scariest moment was, again, it was for a story that I didn't think was that sensitive about poverty alleviation, but after that story, I read about myself in the local press that I was under a national security investigation for talking to people in this province to the southwest of China, and nothing ever came of that, but anything involving national security is really scary because it can involve life in prison, and, I don't know, luckily nothing ever happened, but I think, journalists there and outlets there are really, really careful about doing reporting because there are high risks involved. At the same time, I always encourage people to go to China if you have the opportunity to do so as journalists, as tourists, because I'm laying out all the scary stuff and all the restrictions,
Yeah.
but at the same time, there was also this weird latitude to do a bunch of stories and a bunch of reporting, um, you never knew what was going to work and what was not going to work. So I would try all these stories, and some of them you'd get the people that you wanted, and other people, for whatever reason, you kept running into walls, and you'd have to give up on the story because no one wanted to talk on the record. But just simply by being there and trying, I actually felt like there was still much more room than you would expect to do really great on the ground reporting, and people who were really, really willing to talk and share their experiences.
Right, right. So, again, the whole idea about identity and conformity or non-conformity, one of the profiles that I found, really interesting was the scooter thief, right? And what that person, and I think it's somewhat apropos to sort of the social media environment that we're living in right now. Why don't you tell folks about that person and what you found fascinating about his particular story?
I really have to think. I think it was Sylvie Carr, my book agent, who helped me sell this book, who I think helped really shape this chapter. And The Scooter Thief was a really fun story I did. And again, he was kind of like a peripheral character in a bigger story at the time about lying flat. Has anyone heard of this? Tangping. There's also a related trend that's still very viral today called Neijuan, involution. And it was part of this quiet quitting movement in China. People were tired, they were worn out from the COVID pandemic, from the economic recession that happened afterwards. And I came across this guy who had become infamous for stealing scooters, and he was really bad at it. So he kept getting caught and kept going to prison. And during one of these prison stints, the local television station, I think they caught wind that this guy kept getting arrested for stealing scooters, sent a crew and interviewed him in the jailhouse about why he kept stealing scooters. And they asked him, "Why don't you just get a job?" And he says something to the effect of, "I can't work. I will never work a day in my life, and coming to prison is like coming home for me." And that clip then gets, a few years later, snipped, and it becomes this viral hit, and it becomes a meme. He's still in the clink, so he doesn't know that he's become famous on the internet. And when he gets out, there are cars of agents waiting outside the prison, waiting to sign him as an online influencer. And so by the time I interviewed him, he'd actually become like a minorly successful entrepreneur based on this brand of being a bit of a rebel, um, countercultural figure. And he'd opened up a restaurant, and he'd become the brand ambassador for a scooter company. he was supposed to show how the scooter, he'd introduced all these safety features in the scooter model to make it harder to steal. And so I ended up meeting him, and his story doesn't play out the way that you think it might have. He actually is in quite a bit of trouble now, and I think he's lost the restaurant and a lot of his social media accounts. But it ended up becoming the story about why China cares about what goes on in its cyberspace, and how do you shape an internet that's incredibly big. I mean, you have hundreds of millions of internet users in China, but there's also, at the same time, rampant censorship. Um, but one thing that I really grappled with when I was in China was, if you go online, there's so much information. There's a diversity of products, of cultural creation, of discussion. There's a really, really active social media scene. So how does that all coexist with state censorship? And I think that the scooter thief story really,
Yeah.
really exemplified that.
Right, right. Oh, thank you. Um, okay, so we talked about ethnic. I want to talk, I don't know how to describe, but again, with the idea of identity, we talked about identity for Hong Kong, and then you touched on identity of Taiwan and Taipei, right? Being living in Taipei. So why don't we take, each of those sort of separately? And I think in order to, explain the whole identity issue, how that works, and then the profile that you had for the person in Hong Kong.
Sure. So the book begins with like mainland China proper, the East
Yeah.
Coast where all the big cities are, and then it goes to these borderlands, and that's when the characters about, the Mongolian and the Uyghur family
Yeah.
and the Hui Muslim, that's where they come in. But then the last third of the book is it's not in mainland China. It's in Hong Kong, eventually Taiwan, where I ended up moving and writing most of the book, and also the Chinese diaspora in the US. And the Hong Kong chapters were interesting to me because I had reported on some of these protests basically every weekend. Oh, is that the other event? Is
It
that
must be
sound?
the other event. Yeah.
And as I was reporting, I wanted to find someone, the Hong Kong protests were a big story for me,
Yeah.
and they were eye-opening because I would be in Beijing one week, and then that same evening, fly to Hong Kong because all the protests were Fridays and Saturdays. So I'd spend the weekend, it was actually exhausting, spend the weekend covering these protests and then being tear gassed and then fly back to Beijing. And so you'd go from like quiet, controlled Beijing to towards the middle and end of these protests, Hong Kong, where people were tearing bricks out of the street and throwing them at police and like throwing Molotov cocktails at each other, and things were catching on fire. And like the contrast was huge. And I ended up focusing on one protester who was very active in the front line, but had been born in mainland China and had moved to Hong Kong as an economic migrant, and thought of himself as a Chinese patriot. And it's through his public school education in Hong Kong and real estate inequality, to be honest. The fact that he could never afford an apartment, and he's a civil engineer, he was building his apartments and knew he could never afford one himself, that he gets more politically engaged. And in reporting his story, that story then took me to Taiwan, where I already was, because it turns out he was among a small group of people who flee Hong Kong by fishing boat
Right.
and try to seek asylum in Taiwan. And then from Taiwan, long story short, Taiwan doesn't take them as refugees. They come to the US, and so it was kind of through their physical journey that I ended up getting to speak about and write about all these different issues of how people in Taiwan and Hong Kong and the US are also thinking about Chinese identity and what role they play in the Chinese-speaking world.
So can you give us a little more detail about what those issues are in terms of being Hong Kong as opposed to Chinese, and then Taiwan and all of that, just for folks to get a flavor of that, and how that relates to the theme here of who gets to be Chinese and who isn't Chinese, and why is it important?
I don't talk so much about, a lot of people are discussing now the issue of identity in Taiwan, which has always been an issue because
Right.
it's such a multi-layered society with many, many different levels of colonization in its history. So I don't talk so much in my book about, well, what is Taiwanese versus Chinese? Though I do quote Ma Ying-jeou,
You
being
do,
the
you
former
do.
president of Taiwan
Yeah.
in the beginning of the book. But I find him fascinating. Um, but I talk more about Taiwan and what role it sees itself playing in in the League of Democratic Societies that it sees itself as part of, and it sees a spike in the number of Chinese-born political asylum seekers who are trying to come to Taiwan, believing that it's a democratic open society that will take Chinese-speaking people like them. But unfortunately, Taiwan doesn't have a set asylum process. And so it ends up turning a lot of these people away, which might surprise people. And during the 2019 Hong Kong protests, a lot of Hong Kongers came to Taiwan looking for asylum status, and many of them still don't have it unless they had enough capital to start a business and sponsor their own work permits, essentially. And part of that is it comes down to Taiwan's identity. There's still, mostly on the government side, an ironclad belief that they are the Republic of China, Taiwan, and so therefore their sovereign boundaries include all of the PRC plus the country of Mongolia and the island of Taiwan. And so if you're coming from Hong Kong, you are coming from within the Republic of China. You're not a foreigner who's seeking asylum. And the other is Taiwan on a more fundamental level, thinking about what values does it stand for and what can it afford, what risks can it afford to take in existing next to a much more powerful neighbor, China, which wants to one day take it over. With Hong Kong, I explored identity on a number of levels. There was, of course, what are Hong Kong values? That became a core tenet of why people were protesting against this anti-extradition bill in 2019 to early 2020. They are part of China, but they still see themselves as somehow distinct. So what is the core essence of one country, two systems? What's the core of that system? What are the values that underpin that? And then later, as the crackdown inevitably happened against these protesters, and many started using something called the BNO law to move to the UK, what is the nature of citizenship? Who determines citizenship and who gets to be a Chinese citizen versus someone who's eligible for British residency and later citizenship? And that ended up being a very, very complicated thing as well.
Okay, so we have a number of questions here from the audience.
Okay.
So we'll go through some of these.
I
And
feel like I'm in the hot seat. These are
Yeah,
a lot of
there are
questions.
a lot of questions. So one of them has to do, well, since we're talking about Hong Kong, let's talk about Jimmy Lai, who the former owner of, was it the Apple, I believe it is, and who, very interesting story where he was just basically got rich selling clothes, right?
Yeah.
And was
George
very much a
Orwell.
capitalist and very successful, and then suddenly got thrust, went into journalism and then kind of was a populist in his magazine style, not, I think it was more sort of Post rather than New York Times, became very successful in that, and then suddenly found himself the leader of the protests. He's in jail. So they wanted to know what you think about the fate of Jimmy Lai. And, any thoughts about the way I would term this is, will he be free from jail? What do you think is going to happen? And, I guess the other implication of that is, what can people do?
Uh, I found the timing of Jimmy Lai's trial, which had been dragging on for years, interesting because it came about a month and a half before Keir Starmer went to China.
Right.
He just wrapped up I think he's wrapping up his trip now.
Yeah.
To Beijing and Shanghai. So it's totally possible maybe there might be some kind of diplomatically negotiated release for Jimmy Lai for time served. His verdict has come down. He's been found guilty of a number of national security violations, but his sentence has not been set yet. So there's
Right.
no whether he gets life in prison, 10 years, that hasn't been decided, which means that you have an opening to decide whether he can be let out for time served. So, yeah, it's an open question.
Okay. Um, let's see. Among the many individuals you've profiled, are there particular stories of resilience that you feel captures something universal about the search for identity and dignity?
Absolutely. I loved reporting on the first character in the first chapter of this book. Um, she is
The lawyer.
a lawyer,
Yeah.
and she is just relentless. So, she had both her parents were factory workers in the same state-owned company. And she also came of age during opening reform. And it wasn't totally legal yet, but she decides to strike out on her own and go and apply for one of the new privately run factories that's popping up in Guangdong, where she's from, this province in southern China. And she promptly gets fired, but then she finds another job and she sticks it out, and she finally becomes a low-level employee in the state prosecutor's office and just works her way up. And she becomes very, very well known for this one particular case where a woman comes in, she's a migrant worker, and she's been accused of, and she confesses to it, murdering her young children out of desperation. And this lawyer, Feng Bing, decides instead of asking for the maximum sentence, which is the death sentence, and she has argued for the death sentence many times before in her career for other criminals, she decides to ask for clemency. And she ends up appealing successfully for clemency for this woman, and they become friends, and she becomes this national star. But because, wow, what is happening outside? I'm so curious.
Oh.
Um, she ends up being demoted. And so, halfway through her career, at the time when she should really be at her peak, she changes sides, so to speak, and she becomes a human rights lawyer. So, she at first was, a prosecutor for the state, and now she's a human rights lawyer, often suing the state. And I think the first time I ever interviewed her over the phone, she had just been detained for 7 days and, like, chained to a chair. She'd been trying to access her client, who was a poet who had been arrested, and she was so, like, just comes with the job, being chained to a chair and questioned for 7 days. She was so, clear-eyed about the risks that she faced and really relentless about pursuing the work that she was doing at great physical risk to herself. And as we read later in the chapter, she, ends up taking a huge risk when someone comes to her door one day asking for help. But I think one of the reasons why she was also so brave is because she had worked inside the system. So she knew exactly how it worked and what the risks she faced were.
Okay, and then, are you still in contact with her? Do you know what's happening? Where is she now?
She is fine, and I believe that she is out of the country.
Okay, okay, all right. So there is a questions about the surveillance state in China. Is much feared by many Westerners. Lately, the business sector here has picked up on the idea that China is far outstripping the West tech capacity, including AI. And yet, at least in what Westerners have access to, in terms of, say, AI, is remarkably bad at differentiating non-white faces or non-male voices, for example. How global is the tech? Whereas China's yeah, let's just leave it at that. How global is the tech, and what are the implications you think in terms of where this will go for us here in California, let's say?
Big question.
Yeah.
I am not a tech expert. My sister here, who is, often likes to laugh at how I talk about tech concepts without really understanding the tech buttressing them. But one of a series of stories that I did last year that got me thinking were about the training data that underpins the different LLMs, large language models, that various countries or various companies in various countries are rolling out, and the competition over data. And so, I did a story about how China's LLMs are different from those of Taiwan's, and both from the computing perspective of, like, the computing capacity they have, but also the data sets that they had available to
Mhm,
train their LLMs on were very, very different, and
mhm.
if that created different outcomes, and the
Right.
answer is absolutely yes. Um, I'd be very, very interested in how, like, a Chinese AI model which is primarily trained on,
Right.
a
Right.
certain kind of face probably would be better at certain tasks than Western
Well, we
ones.
should get somebody who's from here.
And,
Yeah.
there were a series of stories when I was in China about how early AI models were specifically trained on, like, Uyghur faces, or, like, ethnic minority faces, or trying to do language recognition for certain languages that only certain groups would use in China, for security reasons, obviously.
Okay, here's another question. If people in China can find ways to dissent despite real personal risk, why does it feel like the US struggles to produce enough public voices willing to challenge the current administration? Okay. All right. So it's let me ask the question this way. I need my glasses. I misread this. But um so the search for identity, and I'm sure you've been asked this question before, and the way the Chinese government is um restricting and enforcing certain things, and in effect punishing, making it difficult all the way around. And how they have done it sort of systematically and in increments. Do you see parallels for us here?
When I was writing this book, I was worried that because it's a multi-year process to write the book, and then once you hand in the draft, like a year before the publisher gets it on shelves, and I was worried that the moment would have passed, like what I was writing about would become totally irrelevant. And I was unpleasantly surprised when it came out that a lot of the questions I would get from readers at events were, do you see any parallels between what you wrote about in China and what we are experiencing here in the US? And I've long maintained, even before the politics of today, that there are more similarities between Chinese politics and China and the U.S. than the two countries would care to admit. But absolutely, I think that there are parallels, and I think both are large, diverse countries that are very concerned about cohesive identities, what they stand for, and the state increasingly concerned with um, trying to enforce a certain version of their ideal citizen.
Right. And then using the security apparatus to enforce whatever, policies are important to them, or penalizing people otherwise. That's me saying it rather. Um, so seeing what's going on in China and what is happening, are there things that we should be really cautious about, or what should we be guarding against in your mind, as you see what's has happened in China over the last 10 years in particular, and then what's happening now?
I mean, I think that the online space matters so much. And I know my friend Steve here, who writes about disinformation and misinformation, is also really concerned about this. But again, one thing that struck me is there is robust cultural creation and online discourse in China, but why doesn't that ever coalesce into a meaningful and substantive conversation about, say, politics or even political reform? And it's because groups are kept separate from one another and content disappears so quickly. And so you see a very seemingly organically curated selection of ideas and posts online. And you have the feeling that you're treading water and that you're talking about things, but in fact, you're not having any kind of traction on real issues. And I worry about that in the US with the way that media is getting fractured and different audiences then go to the platforms that fit what they think more and more. And I worry that without a shared body of commonly agreed facts and knowledge creation, that the same thing could happen to us.
Okay. Okay. Um, what do you think is what is most misunderstood about Chinese society in the West? Partially asking because I have a friend who is unwavering in his support for the Chinese system, often applauding healthcare and the housing infrastructure.
It's a big country and there are many people, and so there is an incredible diversity in viewpoints and in backgrounds. And I think that um, hearing a policy being announced or hearing that this is the official position of the government doesn't necessarily mean that the policy is being implemented the way that the way that it's announced on the ground. Often they would say one thing, but it would look very, very different on the local level. And people have a lot of different opinions.
See. What do you think the next generation of what do you think of the next generation of foreign correspondents and local journalists need to prioritize when covering identity, culture, and resistance under tightening controls in China?
I mean, first of all, we would need more foreign correspondents to
Yeah.
do that. There are fewer and fewer who are in China, mostly because it's expensive and it's really hard to get visas. And because there are fewer foreign correspondents, it means that if you had to prioritize, you're probably covering breaking news, hard news, what's happening in foreign policy and economics. And there isn't as much time to cover something as fluffy, but equally meaningful, I'd argue, as identity in China.
Okay. Um, your book captures the daily realities of life under Xi Jinping, from language restrictions to social pressures. How do you see these individual stories connecting to broader policy decisions? And do these stories change how you view the US China relations?
Hmm.
Big question, too.
I mean, this homogenization of identity was running concurrent with a greater emphasis on national security over economic growth and a much more nationalistic and aggressive foreign policy as well. And so I saw these things as interrelated, that China was not only much more confident and concerned with homogenizing how people behaved at home, but was also much more confident in acting on the global stage as well, and promoting what they would call uniquely Chinese models for cyberspace or for economic development or for foreign aid, as a contrast to, mostly left unsaid, American models for doing the same. So thinking of the Chinese way as a distinct way that could then be replicated in other countries. How has it changed how I think about the US-China relationship? Again, I see these two superpowers as often really, really similar, and the anxieties and the challenges that they face. And so I'm always a proponent of the two countries talking and cooperating more.
So do you think in that context, there's a lot of misunderstanding between the two about each other? And do you think that's part of the reason why we were having, there's a perceived conflict between the two and this whole idea of competition and maybe rivalry for sure? Do you think we're going in the wrong direction, and in terms of people not really understanding what China is about?
So I don't think China's trying to take over the world.
Right.
I think they very much want to be a regional power, and they are, but I don't think they're trying to take over the world. And I also don't think that they're this superpower behemoth that gets everything right and is going to supersede the US one day. On the other hand, I don't think that it's a country so riddled by corruption and by fake economic statistics and political infighting that they're one day going to collapse completely. I think it is a big, complicated country with strengths and weaknesses, just like the US. And um, we I see both narratives often competing with each other and trying to justify certain policies regarding China, but they're inherently contradictory. China can't be the strongest country out there and also on the brink of
Right.
collapse.
Um, so maybe, well, if people, do you subscribe to the notion that the United States is a decline, that China is actually rising, but the idea is a competition between the two, and there's so many people who are set that China is actually going to win, right? What's your reaction to that?
I think sometimes it's a competition, but there are so many areas, particularly on climate change and on energy, that there could be incredible cooperation on and would benefit both countries. I think that China hasn't been doing really anything new that it hasn't publicly announced in the last 20 years, but that by contrast, maybe we're looking at ourselves and noticing the gaps are widening between the two countries. But it's not like all of a sudden over the last 5 years, China has taken leaps and bounds ahead. I do think that there are certain technologies that we prioritize today that China is really, really well positioned to do. So the electric car, I think, is perfect. I mean, this is a manufacturing issue, a manufacturing um, item that China has perfected manufacturing and then mass producing and combining all the different components that it's done so well individually into one product, and then creating huge citywide platforms that then can support these vehicles. It could be that in 25 years, the technology that we're going to need most of is something that American society or maybe the African continent is better at solving. I don't really know, but right now, when it comes to electric cars and even semiconductor manufacturing, I think the scale that China's been able to create has been really advantageous. But I just don't think that rule might not hold forever.
Okay. So along these lines, I'm talking about what kind of misconceptions does China have about the United States in your
Hmm.
mind? And let's talk about both at the policy level, and let's talk about the general populace, maybe the netizens or, the people who are on the internet or, bouncing off all these ideas. I think to me, there's misinformation as well as misunderstanding on both sides. So what do you think on the Chinese side from what you've experienced? Something that policymakers said, and you go, "Oh my gosh, that is completely wrong." Right?
They're increasing the last few years I was in China, this really widely held view that America was trying to contain China, that there was a vast plot to stymie its economic development. And I just don't think that the average American really thinks that much about China or has that kind of enmity towards a Chinese person. There was still a very, very rosy view of what the US was like in China, that everyone was wealthy and that every school that kids could go to was good. And although America was trying to contain China, still life in the US was better because American society valued individual human life more than Chinese society. So there were these weird contradictions and perceptions. Um, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay. No, no, no. And along these lines, we have a YouTube chat question, which is this is the first time I've had one of these. It's great. Um, from your reporting, did your reporting uncover nuances that policymakers often miss? So let's go on both ways. So, um, what is it that American policymakers miss that you said they say, oh, these guys don't really get it? It's their circumstance. Yeah. Okay. Um,
I feel like a broken record, but I keep coming to the point that China is not
come on.
a monolith. One it's not one agent with one motivation and a set of policies that, if they're announced in Beijing, are perfectly executed the next day in all of its provinces and regions. It's just so much more messy than that. And it is an autocratic society, but there are push and pull forces um, that might not happen from the grassroots up. But just because Xi Jinping decides something is going to happen, it doesn't necessarily mean that it ends up being fulfilled, because there are ways to push back against things and to um, change policy. I think about the way that the COVID pandemic restrictions ended in China and how a building fire on the western side of the country in Xinjiang then traveled to Shanghai and led to protests there, which then inspired protests in Beijing and the rest of the country. And by all accounts, really surprised leaders in Beijing at how unhappy people were with these COVID restrictions, which they then abruptly pulled, maybe too abruptly, for public health reasons. So I think that China always takes me by surprise, at least. And so when trying to analyze why things happen in China, to not assume that everyone is thinking the same way.
Yeah, actually, someone asked that in this question, they asked me from my experience, with policy, what challenges do U.S. leaders face in understanding Chinese society beyond the headlines? And I completely agree. I think that, one of the things I appreciated about your book was showing how diverse China is in reality, right? Everyone thinks it is a monolith of people, right? But there's so many minorities and ethnic and different languages that are spoken there, right? And to keep that country together is not an easy thing, right? And so I think people forget that and they just lump it. And it's just because intellectually it's easier to do that, right? And the other thing that I think policymakers face, which I understand directly, is for senior policymakers, there's a limited amount of time they have,
Mm,
right? I mean, they just don't have time to consider all these issues. Now, if you're like a small country, you focus mostly on China. I mean, you can mostly focus on the United States and these. So there are only a couple countries, but the United States, we do everything. So in the U.S. government, it's like the competition is for your time. You
mm.
only get stuff that comes to you that is really the most important. And so for people who are trying to push these policies that are nuanced, it's really hard for them to do. Um, okay, so as you know, out of all the characters and the profiles, let's ask, what was the one that you found the most, and we've talked about them. So if you want to, the one that you found the most surprising, I guess is the best way, that you went in and suddenly it was completely different from what you thought it was going to be.
That is a good question. I think it was the scooter thief. I thought this was gonna be a fun, feel-good story, and we were gonna get some great sound bites, and that would be it. It would be this really colorful slacker dude who runs a late night bar, essentially, and we'd have some fun and then head back home, and it ended up being a really, really difficult story to report. Um, it turns out that somehow the police had found out that we wanted to interview him, So they put pressure on him. He ended up trying to sue us, and it just became this like ongoing thing. Even a year later, but it was in trying to parse why it was such a sensitive story, why promoting quiet quitting would be so sensitive, that then led me, I think, to the meat of the chapter.
Right. And so along those lines, was there a story, was there a favorite story for you? That one that made you, out of all your reporting or the people that you've met that you remember that has stayed with you, that makes you feel really good? And is there one that makes you feel really bad, and for what reason?
One of the stories that we haven't talked about is the Uyghur family that also have a chapter in this book. And it ended up taking me about 2 years to report that story because basically what had happened was these were Chinese-born Uyghurs who had then migrated to Turkey. So they were Turkish citizens, but they would move back and forth between Turkey and China for business. And this man brought his children with them. And as the detention campaign kicked off in 2017, they ended up getting stuck in Xinjiang. And eventually the father's allowed to leave, but soon after he leaves, he finds out that his wife has been arrested and he doesn't know what's happened to their young children who had an exit ban put on them. And it turns out that they had been separated from the mother and put into a Chinese state boarding school. And so the chapter really details how he goes through these diplomatic channels to get his children back. And I had heard about this story because he did get his children back and they just landed in Turkey. And I wanted to, of course, interview them, but it took about 2 years before the children were ready to be interviewed. It took some time for them to mentally recover, and before he felt that he wanted to go public with this story. And I mean, that topic and the Uyghurs in general and these family separations have been a theme in reporting that I've done in years, even up until this year, honestly.
So as China continues to assert itself globally, while tightening internally, and grows and changes, what do you think the future holds for the people you've profiled and for the idea of pluralism in China more broadly?
It's probably a bad sign, but most of the people who are main characters in my book are now outside of the People's Republic of China. So, other than the characters in the very last chapter who are Chinese people living in the diaspora, who are already thinking about how to keep creating in the Chinese language, in various Chinese languages, and maintain their Chinese identity outside of the PRC. Other than those people, everyone has left, and so I think it is a sign of the times that there isn't room for them
Okay.
in
So,
China.
so we're coming close to the end. We're coming close to the end of our time. So one of the things I always like to ask people who come with us, and you have a couple, I'll give you a little time about what you want people to leave with. There's a lot of really interesting stories in your book, a lot of interesting people, a lot of sad, some very compelling and difficult stories that you've told. And I know that they've been very difficult for you as well. Um, if a reader walks away from Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, two insights, what do you hope? What would they be?
There is an increasingly robust Chinese diaspora community in Southeast Asia and Japan and North America and Europe. And there are news sites like Initium and Chinese language podcasts, and even physical spaces like bookstores and festivals that people are putting on to think about not just political questions, but also cultural questions as Chinese people using Chinese languages, but just outside of China. And that's been a trend that I've noticed has really expanded post COVID, which has been really, really heartening. And the second is I mean, I feel really bad. I realized after writing this book, like, all the stories are really, really sad. It's not exactly a beach read, but I am hoping that for people who have or have never been to China, that you read the book and you get a sense of what it would be like to live in another person's shoes and what it was like to live in China for that period of time. I very much miss it, and I hope that in the book there is a little bit of that texture and rhythm of life in China, even if you've never been.
Okay. Emily, thank you for your extraordinary work. Thank you for the book. And thank you for joining us
Thank
tonight
you
and
so much
sharing
for
your
having me, and thank you everyone for sharing your time with me.
Um, as we close, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, your book, offers not just a clear picture of China and its diversity under Xi Jinping, even under Xi Jinping, but I think it's a really deeply human account of resilience and moral choice under pressure. And thank you for doing that and for showing us, that part of China. Um, Again, let's thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for being part of this conversation, and we hope you'll continue engaging the Commonwealth Club World Affairs programs like this one. Please visit us at our website at commonwealthclub.org.events, and we'll see you at upcoming programs. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.